Respected ulama, my respected elders, my brothers, my sisters and my little ones, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. After praising the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending salutations on Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, I begin as always by first thanking you, my host, for giving me this opportunity to convey the message of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And I pray to the Almighty Allah that Allah accepts these efforts of yours in listening to this message. As I pray to the Almighty Allah that Allah accepts these efforts of yours in my efforts in delivering this message and your efforts in listening to this message. Many of our youngsters today are confused with regards to the concept of taqleed and whether it is permissible to actually follow a madhab or not. So much so that you have today an insignificant minority, due to ignorance, who have gone as far as saying this, that making taqleed is shirk. Much has been said by the scholars before me. And one thing you will have learned today is that in the light of the Quran and Sunnah, and as a result of verses of Quran like فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنكُمْ وَلَوْ رَدُّوهُ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ وَإِلَى أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْهُمْ لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ. As a result of verses like this, you will have learned not only is taqleed permissible, it is compulsory upon every individual that has not reached the level of ijtihad. What I'm going to say and what I'm going to add to what has already been said is this: that since the doors of ijtihad have closed, and it's been about 1,000 years, every master that has come has followed one of the four schools of thought. He either followed the Hanafi school of thought, the Maliki school of thought, the Shafi'i school of thought, or the Hanbali school of thought. That is every mufassir that has come. Every muhaddith, every master of the Quran, every master of the hadith, and every mu'arrikh, every historian that has come after the doors of ijtihad were closed, has followed one of the four schools of thought, and he has made taqleed. And the scholars that I make a mention of, if you want to sort of get a rough idea of how much knowledge these scholars possess, then what I would say to you is this: all the scholars that we have today, irrespective of what school of thought that they follow, if you were to take them, and if you were to take the knowledge that they possessed, and you were to place them in one pan of the balance, and you were to take just one of these scholars that I make a mention of and his knowledge, and you were to place him in the second pan of the balance, you will realize that the knowledge this one master possessed would outweigh the knowledge all the scholars of this day and age possess put together. I mean, my young friends, you had the likes of the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Who was the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani? In the world of knowledge, in the world of ilm, in any book, when the word hafiz is mentioned by itself, then there is only one person that is being referred to, and that is none other
than the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Some scholars, like the great Jalaluddin Suyuti rahmatullah alayhi, who follow the Shafi'i school of thought. And this man himself was phenomenal. He's a man of over 500 works. He would describe the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani as a sign from amongst the signs of Allah. You know, these are powerful words from a powerful man. A sign from amongst the signs of Allah. Some scholars would describe the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani as the second Bayhaqi. Some went as far as saying this, that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was the Imam al-Bukhari of his time. And the great master, Izzuddin Abdus Salam al-Maqdisi, Shaykh al-Salahiyya, went as far as saying this, إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ مِثْلَ الْبُخَارِ فَلَا يَقْصُرْ عَنْ. That if he was not like Bukhari, one thing is for sure, that the status of this man was no less than the status of the great Bukhari himself. Balki the Muhaddis of Hijaz, Najmuddin Umar ibn Fahd, he would say, فَلَوْ حَلَلْتُ بَيْنَ الرُّكْنِ وَالْمَكَامِ وَحَلَفْتُ أَنِّي مَا رَأَيْتُ بِعَيْنِيَّ مِثْلَهُ وَلَمْ تَرَى عَيْنُ مَنْ رَآهُ مِثْلَهُ وَلَا رَأَتْ عَيْنُهُ مِثْلَ نَفْسِهِ لَبَرَرْتُ. He would say that if I was to stand between the black stone, the Hajr Aswad, and the Maqam Ibrahim and the place of Ibrahim, and while standing there I took an oath, I took a qasam, I swear by Allah, my eyes have never seen a scholar like the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And then I took this oath a step further, and I said, I swear by Allah, the eyes of those that have seen Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani have never seen a scholar like him. Then I took this oath even further, and I said, I swear by Allah, the eyes of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani have never seen a man like himself. Then my oath would stand, and I would not have violated my oath. You know, when the great Hafiz al-Iraqi was on the point of death, and in a minute I'm going to tell you who Hafiz al-Iraqi was. When he was on the point of death and he was asked the $1 million question, who have you left behind you? Who can take your place? Which scholar can take your seat? The great Hafiz al-Iraqi mentioned 3 people. The first scholar that he mentioned was the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. The second scholar that he mentioned was the great son of his, Abu Zur'a. And the third scholar that he mentioned was the great Haythami. You know, the remarkable thing is, when Iraqi made a mention of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, that he is the person that I'm leaving behind that will be able to take my place, in terms of knowledge, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was only 33 years of age, which in terms of knowledge is this, that he was only a child. In terms of knowledge, 33 is like a baby. Now, for you to understand what the great Iraqi said, let me put it into context. Who was the great Iraqi? Hafiz al-Iraqi. My friends, he memorized the Quran at the age of 8. Hafiz al-Iraqi, he memorized the entire Quran at the age of 8. He memorized half of Al-Hawi, a book in Islamic jurisprudence on the fiqh of Shafi'i. He memorized half of this book in 15 days. You can say, subhanallah, but I know you haven't comprehended what I've said. Because you don't know what Al-Hawi is, nor have you seen it. So what I'm going to say to you is, when this conference finishes, and you can actually find a library that's got this, go have a look at it. And then open it and look at the text of this book. And when you see this, now what you will say to me, that this is beyond belief. How could he have memorized half of this book in 15 days? And when you say this to me, I will turn around and say to you, let me tell you, my brother, forget al-Hawi, put it to one side. He memorized 400 lines of Imam in just one day. See, you gobsmacked. 400 lines of Imam. You know, when I don't get a response, it means you're baffled. 400 lines, except for the Bradfordians. 400 lines of Imam in 400 days. You know, this is phenomenal. The human mind can't comprehend it. Let me just put that for you in Quranic terms. In Quranic terms, an average page of the Quran has how many lines? 13 lines. The South African print has 13 lines. One juz of the Quran has around 28 pages, 28 sides. So if you were to times 28 by 13, you would get 364 lines. 364 lines. You know, that in Quranic terms is phenomenal. Where will you find in history a man, if we were to put this in Quranic terms, 364 lines, he learnt 400 in a day. In Quranic terms, this is phenomenal because it adds to over one juz of the Quran in one day. Which basically means indirectly that he was in a position of memorizing the Quran in 30 days, 30 juz. And this was not the Quran. You know, the Quran, the miraculous aspect of the Quran is this, that it can be memorized so easily. Why? Because Allah Himself says, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ. That is the miraculous aspect of the Quran. This is why we find children who cannot even speak their mother tongue, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age, they are able to memorize the Quran. You know, these were books on different sciences. On top of this man was a man of many works, his commentary on Tirmizi being one of the most famous. So when he was on the point of death, now you can sort of get a rough idea of the caliber of the man, or the worth of the man, or how big of a scholar this man was. When he's on the point of death and he's asked, who will now take your place? What do you think will be the status of that scholar or that individual? The great Iraqi makes a mention of. And then realizing that the scholar that he's making a mention of, in terms of knowledge, he's only a child. Let me give you an example in boxing terms, or football terms. Now you had the great Muhammad Ali. The great Muhammad Ali. And everyone knows about his greatness in the field of boxing. One of the greatest, if not the greatest boxers the world has ever seen. If Muhammad Ali was questioned on the point of death, who have you left behind you? What would you think would be the status of that boxer that the great Ali himself makes a mention of? And then let us say this boxer that the great Ali makes a mention of, in terms of boxing, he's still a child. He's only 16 years of age. And Ali is saying, okay, after me, this is the man the eyes should be watching. And let us say this boxer that Ali makes a mention of surpasses the great Ali himself. What would you say to me then? This is exactly what the great Iraqi was saying. Because this man that he made a mention of, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, not only surpassed the great Iraqi, not only did he surpass the expectations of the great Iraqi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani even surpassed his own expectations. And why do I say this? Because the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani would always admire the great Zahabi. And he would dream of that status that Allah had bestowed upon the great Zahabi. So much so, where Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani performed Hajj in the 800th year of Hijrah, and he drank Zamzam, you know the dua that he made was this: Oh Allah, I beg you, give me the same status that you bestowed upon the great Zahabi. This is what he would dream of. This is the status that he'd want. And very soon you're going to get to know who the great Zahabi was. So this is the dua that he made. He says, 20 years after this, after making this dua, after having Zamzam, 20 years after this, I came for Hajj another time. And this time, he says, فَوَجَدْتُ مِن نَفْسِي طَلَبَ الْمَزِيدَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. He says, I felt within my heart, this time, that now I should ask the Almighty Allah for a status higher than the one that I asked Him on the previous occasion. He says, that's what I felt within myself. So what I did was, I asked Allah after drinking Zamzam for a status higher than the one that I'd previously asked Him of. And I have hope in Allah that I will achieve and get to that rank and achieve that status. Never mind hoping, the great Sakhawi, a master of many books, Shafi'i school of thought, says, he achieved that status. Meaning he surpassed the status of the great Zahabi, and many people have witness to the fact that he achieved that status. Remarkable. Allah had blessed this man with such intellect that in spite of the fact that he was an orphan, his father died at the age of 4. His mother died before this. Just like his ustad memorized the Quran at the age of 8, the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani memorized the Quran at the age of 8. At the age of 12, he's standing in Masjid al-Haram on the Musalla and leading the believers in the Taraweeh prayer in Masjid al-Haram. He was not just Hafiz of the Quran, he was the Hafiz of the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they gave the title Hafiz to any scholar that knew 100,000 plus Hadiths of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in and out, sanadan, matanan, jarhan, ta'dilan, tarikhiyan. Not only was he a Hafiz of the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the man knew books after books off by heart. He knew the Minhaj al-Wusul of Baydafi off by heart. He knew Umdatul Ahkam off by heart. He knew Al-Hawi al-Saghir of Qazwini off by heart. He knew a book on Nahwa of Sahib Maqamat al-Hariri off by heart. He knew the Alfiya of Iraqi off by heart. He knew Alfiya of Ibn Malik in Nahw off by heart. He knew the Tanbih of Shirazi off by heart. You know, the man had, if I were to say the man had a photographic memory, I wouldn't be lying. Why? Because when he want to memorize something, he wouldn't memorize like you and I memorize today. What is known as the repetition fashion, or what you call the parrot fashion. When he wanted to memorize something, all he would do is this. He would focus, he would concentrate, and after that he would present it from his memory. When he was working on Al-Hawi al-Saghir, what he would do was, he would work on a page. After having worked on a page, he would then read the text by focusing and by concentrating. And after he'd read the text by focusing and by concentrating, the third time he would present it from his memory. This is what he'd do. Anything that he would ever want to memorize, this is how he would do it. Focus, concentrate, and then present it from his memory. The great Sakhawi, he relates an incident which shows how Allah blessed this man. He says, on one occasion we asked our Shaykh Zain al-Iraqi with regards to the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-mukatabu kinnun ma baqiya alayhi dirhamun. We asked him this question, man sahhahu? Who has authenticated this hadith? And he says, our Shaykh said, I don't know. He says, on the same day we met the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And we asked him the exact same question, who has authenticated this hadith? Al-mukatabu kinnun ma baqiya alayhi dirhamun. And the author goes and he makes a special mention of this fact, that at the time when this question was posed to him, there was not a single white hair in his beard, And what he was saying was, in terms of knowledge, at the time, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was still a child. From the top of his head there and then he said, صححه ابن حبان والحاكم من حديث عبد الله بن عمر وهما في كتب شيخنا ثم عين له مكان الحديث. The Ibn Hibban and Hakim has authenticated this hadith from the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr. This hadith is in the books of our Shaykh. And then he pinpointed where this hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in the books of his Shaykh. You know, on one occasion, he went for Salatul Taraweeh in the month of Ramadan. And the great Shaykh Shihabuddin ibn Asad, before Isha Salah, in front of an audience that was present in the masjid, he was reciting the hadiths of Rasulullah from the work of Hafiz al-Mundhiri, the At-Targhib wa Tarhib. And this book, my young friends, it's like this. And it's in 4 volumes. Each volume is around 500 pages. And Shaykh Shihabuddin, to the audience that was present inside the masjid, was relating the hadiths of this particular book. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was sitting in one corner and he was just listening to it throughout. Afterwards, when he finished reciting the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the great Shaykh of Islam, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, said to Shaykh Shihabuddin that it seems that such and such a hadith, and he then mentioned the hadiths, are missing from your version or your copy of this book, At-Targhib wa Tarhib. How can it be? The only way this is possible is if the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the Shaykh al-Islam, knew the 4 volumes of At-Targhib wa Tarhib off by heart. You know what Shaykh Shihabuddin said to him? Oh, Shaykh al-Islam, they're not missing from my book. I left them out purposely because I could not recall the correct pronunciation of the words at the time when I was reciting them. Allah bless this man in every aspect, so much so that he could have the hadith of Rasulullah being recited upon him, and at the same time he could write fatwas and he could write books without ever losing focus on any one of the two. But you will find narrations like this, that he's writing books. The hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are being recited upon him, and while this is happening, he's writing his book, and at the same time, he's rectifying the reciter that is reading the hadith of Rasulullah upon him. The great Qadi al-Qudat, Chief Justice of his time, Al-Badr ibn al-Tanasi, he relates. He says, I would come to Shaykh al-Islam ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and I would make qira'ah, I would recite the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to him, and what I would find is that the great Shaykh, every time I came, he would continue writing his books. And he wouldn't pay any attention. And I would think to myself, I come from so far and wide, and I put so much effort, and every time I come, the Shaykh is occupied and he's always writing. It's so possible that I might be making mistakes in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I said, I felt so hurt and so saddened that this man has no regard for me. So what I said to myself was, you know what? I'm going to purposely make mistakes. He said, this is the thought that crossed my mind, and I actually implemented this. And what I did was, I decided to make a mistake, and I read the text of the hadith wrong. He says, as soon as I read the hadith wrong, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani raised his head, and he said, A'id, repeat what you've just recited. And he said, this time, I read the text right, and he lowered his head again. He says, from that instance, I realized that this man's mind is always present, even though he may be writing. You know, you talk about reading the Quran fast, that Allah had blessed him with this, with such a tongue, that he was able to recite the hadith of Rasulullah like no other man. The Sunan of Ibn Majah, he read in 4 majlises. The Sahih of Muslim, he read in 5 majlises. An-Nasai al-Kabir and the Sahih of al-Bukhari, he read in 10 majlises. And each majlis was about 4 hours. He read the Al-Mu'jam al-Saghir of Tabrani, which is in 1 volume, contains around 1500 hadiths. With the Sanad and Matan, he read that in 1 majlis from Zohr till Asr. With this, Allah blessed him that he could write like no other human being. He wrote the Taqyid of Ibn Nuqta in 5 days. Taqyid of Ibn Nuqta in 5 days. Allah blessed him so much that, my friends, he wrote 270 works. 270 works he wrote. He wrote on every aspect of Islam. Every aspect of Islam. And if you just want to make a comparison of the caliber of the man, what I will say to you today is, you will find a book today called Al-Mu'jam Al-Mufahris Li-Alfaz Hadith Nabawi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This book was first printed in 1936. It's in around 7, 8 to 8 volume, depending on what print you've got. And this book basically is a dictionary of the Hadith of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam for around 9 books. Now, this book was written by a group of Orientalists with the help of the great Shaykh Muhammad Fuad Abdul Baqi, and it was first printed in 1936. And it took this whole Jamaat of scholars well over 20 years to write just this one book. And alhamdulillah, it's an absolutely superb book. And to get this book to its printing stage, they had help from different governments and different educational institutes. From England, they had help. They had help from Sweden. They had help from Holland. They had help from Denmark. So many scholars, so many masters, over 20 years of effort, so much money has been invested, and they come out with one work, Al-Mu'jam Al-Mufaris Li-Alfaz Hadith Nabawi. Put them on one scale, and you just have one Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani who has come out with over 270 works. 270 works. And if you look at his books, you'll understand the caliber of the man. Nearly every book of his was like a masterpiece. I mean, just his book, Fatawa Shahr, Ajab al-Dahr min Fatawa Shahr, he wrote in 1 month. His book, Taghliq al-Ta'liq, Taghliq al-Ta'liq. In that one book alone, he's made a reference of over 360 books. 360 books. If you look at his commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, known as Fathul Bari, and this is one of the best, if not the best commentaries ever written up to this day, and it'll probably remain like this right till the day of judgment, if it's not the best commentary to be written on Sahih al-Bukhari. Balki Jalaluddin Suyuti goes as far as saying, لم يصنف أحد في الأولين ولا في الآخرين مثله. No man, no from amongst the former and no from amongst the latter, has ever written a book like the Fathul Bari of the great Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. If you were to open that book, you will realize the worth and the value of the man. When the great Shawkani was questioned, and this was the request that was put forward to him, is, we want you to write a commentary on the Sahih al-Bukhari. You know what the great Shawkani said when this request was made to him? He narrated the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, La hijrata ba'da al-fath, that there is no migration after Fatih Makkah. What he was referring to was not Fatih Makkah as in the conquest of Makkah. He was referring to Fathul Bari of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani has already conquered Bukhari. There is now nothing left for anyone else that he can do with Sahih al-Bukhari. The question that I want to ask you is, why is it that this man who was an authority when it came to religion, he was an authority when it came to the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the man who understood hadith so much that he was able to write the Fathul Bari, which is the best commentary ever written on Sahih al-Bukhari, and there is not a scholar on planet Earth which can do without this book. Why is it after possessing so much knowledge, the man followed the Shafi'i school of thought? Why did he do taqlid? Why was he a muqallid? I mean, you had the great Zahabi. And I've just told you a few minutes ago that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani would dream of the status that Allah gave the great Zahabi. Who was Imam Zahabi? You know, just like Imam al-Shafi'i would say with regards to Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Shafi'i would say with regards to Abu Hanifa, الناس في الفقه عيال على أبي حنيفة, that people, when it comes to Islamic jurisprudence, are all dependent on the great Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh. This is what Shafi'i would say with regards to Abu Hanifa. Jalaluddin Suyuti rahmatullah alayh and others would say with regards to the great Zahabi, they would say that all the masters of hadith are now dependent when it comes to narrators and when it comes to any science of hadith. Any science of hadith, they are all dependent on 4 people, and one of those that Jalaluddin Suyuti rahmatullah alayhi would mention is the great Zahabi. He was, according to his student Tajuddin as-Subki, who followed the Shafi'i school of thought, Tajuddin as-Subki would say with regards to the great Zahabi, he would say, he was the Imam al-Jar wa Ta'dil. Jar and Ta'dil is the most difficult science from amongst the sciences of hadith. And this man was the authority when it came to this science. But some scholars went as far as saying that he was a sign of Allah when it came to this science. How much knowledge do you think this man possessed? And the only way to grasp how much knowledge this man possessed is when you actually look at his works and you look at what he's written with regards to knowledge and what he actually classed as knowledge and what his criteria for knowledge was. This man lived in the latter part of the 7th century and the first half of the 8th century. And whilst he was alive, in his era, you had scholars like the great Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah. You had Ibn Taymiyyah al-Hanbali, who followed the Hanbali school of thought. He was alive. You had Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi, who followed the Hanbali school of thought. He was alive. You had the great Zayla'i, who followed the Hanafi school of thought. He was alive. You had the great Mizzi, who followed the Shafi'i school of thought. All these scholars were alive. And the caliber of these scholars was such. For example, you had the great Ibn Taymiyyah al-Hanbali. Such was the quality of this scholar, that the great Ibn Taymiyyah al-Hanbali, when he stood before the Almighty Allah, so much fear of Allah, that in prayer he would literally shake and move from left to right. Every morning after Fajr Salah, he would sit down and make dhikr. And he would not move from his place till the sun had risen. And he would say, this is my breakfast. And if I don't have this, my entire body becomes weak. The great Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, whenever a problem arose, or something that I couldn't solve, some hadith or some verse of the Quran I couldn't understand, I would make istighfar. I would ask Allah for repentance. And I would do this 1,000 times or more. Keep on asking Allah to forgive me. Keep on asking Allah to forgive my sins. Till Allah himself would open my heart and the problem would be resolved. Sometimes he says, I would enter the masjid and I would fall in prostration. And the dua that I would make is, Ya Muallima Ibrahim Fahimni. Ya Muallima Ibrahim Fahimni. Or the teacher of Ibrahim alayhi salam, give me the understanding, give me the understanding. And he would not get out of prostration till Allah would give him the understanding and he would understand that particular verse of the hadith of Rasulullah. You had the great Ibn Asakir. If you want to know who Ibn Asakir is, then all you've got to do is after this gathering is go pick up the Tariq of Dimashq of Ibn Asakir. Before he was even born, his father saw a dream that Allah is going to give you a son through which Allah will revive the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not only his father, his mother saw a dream that Allah is going to give you a son who is going to be special. Take him to a certain place and give sadaqah, as Allah will bless you through him and Allah will bless the believers through him. You had the great Ibn Kathir. Tell me, my friends, who hasn't heard of Ibn Kathir, the Shafi'i scholar? Who doesn't have a copy of the tafsir of Ibn Kathir in his home? Who hasn't heard of Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya? Who hasn't heard of Al-Nihaya fil Fitan wal-Malahim? Who hasn't heard Jami' al-Masanid? He was a man of over 20 works. Not only was he Hafiz al-Quran, Hafiz al-Hadith, amongst the scholar he was known as Hafiz al-Mutun. He knew many books, the text of many books off by heart. You had Hafiz al-Midhi. Just one of his works was 200 volumes. 200 volumes, my friends. This was the caliber of the scholars that were alive at the time of the great Zahabi. You had the great Zayla'i, Nasb al-Raya fi Takhrij Ahadith al-Hidayah, the Hanafi scholar. Read this book and you will see the worth of the man. All these scholars were alive the time of Dhahabi. But this is what Dhahabi has to say with regards to knowledge in his time. Now, in his translation of the great Muhaddis Ishaq ibn Bahlul, this is what he writes. With regards to Ishaq ibn Bahlul, he writes that in Baghdad, this man related 50,000 hadith of Rasulullah, text and chain, off by heart. You know, this is some going, guys. You know, if I was to just give you one hadith of Rasulullah with text and chain, it'd probably take you a week to learn it. And if I were to give you 10, it'd probably take you a year to learn it. And when you related 10, you'd become baffled and you'd be just mixing everything all over. And this man is relating 50,000 hadiths off by heart. And when he writes in his translation, you know, after this he writes, you know what? This is what you call hifz. Memorization. You know, today we have a lot of hafiz who can barely stand on the masalla and read just a juz of the Quran in the month of Ramadan. And then once upon a time you'd have a hafiz who would begin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, and won't get up from his place till he got to one nas. That's what you call hafiz. So he says, when you relate to these 50,000 hadiths, this is what you call hifz. And if a person can't do this, then you really can't say that he's a hafiz ul hadith. And then he says, you know, in our time, and he lived in the latter part of the 7th and the first half of the 8th. He says, in our time, if a person was to relate just 1,000 hadith of Rasulullah with sanad and matan, text and chain of narration, all of a sudden people will begin to say, wow, wow. People will begin to hold him in high esteem. In his time, he talks about, he says, أَمَّا الْيَوْمِ فَمَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الْعُلُومِ الْقَلِيلَ إِلَّا الْخَلِيلِ فِي أُنَاسٍ قَلِيلٍ مَا أَقَلْ مَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِنْهُمْ بِذَلِكَ الْقَلِيلِ حَسْبَنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلِ. He says, as for our times now, out of the few sciences that were left, all you will find is a little bit of knowledge. And this little bit of knowledge you will find in a handful of people, a few people. And then he says, this little bit of knowledge which you will find in a handful of people, how less are those that actually act upon this little that they have. And he's talking about his era. In the translation of the great Darimi, he writes these words, فَعَلَى عِلْمِ الْحَدِيثِ وَعُلَمَائِهِ لَيَبْكِي مَنْ كَانَ بَاكِيًا. On the knowledge of ilm, the hadith of Rasulullah, and the scholars of hadith, should one cry for those that want to cry. He says Islam has become weak just like it began. Every man should now strive to save himself from the fire of hell. And he was saying this in the latter part of the 7th century. And why did he say this? Because he was comparing his era with the golden eras of Islam before this. When you here, you have a few thousand here today listening to the words of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, when a muhaddis would sit down and begin to lecture hadith, you would have more people listening to the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam than you would have supporters of United at Old Trafford. 70,000, 80,000, 30,000, 40,000. You know, you and I, we can barely keep our heads upright. After 3-4 hours, you know, our heads are going to the left and the right as if we were intoxicated. Yeah? And when they related the hadith, look at the passion, look at the love. Yeah? When they related the hadith of Rasulullah, you would have 10,000 people just with ink pots. Ink pots and pens to take notes. You and I, it goes in one ear and comes out in the next ear, and Bob's your uncle type thing. They would actually write the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam down. When, I mean, he was talking about eras like, you know, you had Abu Bakr, Al-Hafidh ibn Al-Hafidh, Abu Bakr ibn Abi Dawood As-Sijistani. He says himself, okay, when I was in Isbahan, I related 36,000 hadiths off by heart. And you know what he says after this? He says, you know what? They said to me, you've made mistakes in 7 of them. Where is 36,000 and where is 7 mistakes? So he says, I went back to check. And I found 5 of them exactly like the way I had related them. So he was making a comparison with those eras, the golden eras of Islam. And this is what he says about his own era. How much knowledge do you think that this man possessed? That in spite of the fact that the great Ibn Kathir is alive and you are benefiting from his work, the Shafi'i scholar, Mizzi is alive, Zayla is alive, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi is alive, the great Ibn Taymiyyah is alive, Ibn Asakir is alive, and this man is saying the knowledge has come to an end. How much knowledge do you think he possessed? He was, if not the greatest scholar of his time. The man wrote on every aspect of Islam. That's how much Allah blessed him. 270 works. Just like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, this man wrote 270 works on every aspect of Islam. You know, just his Tarikh of Islam, Tariq al-Islam, you'll find that in 40 volumes. You know, when these people picked up the pen, then, you know, it wasn't Baba, black sheep, you know, a few pages and here you go. Do you understand? His Tariq of Islam was in 40 volumes, in which he wrote the translation of 40,000 people. This is why the great Tajuddin al-Subki says, you know what? It was like as if Allah placed the whole ummah for this man right before him on a flat plane. And it was like he could actually see them and he was there and he began to inform us of these people in his books. This is why he earned himself the title, the historian of Islam. When you go from here, ask for the Sirah A'lam Nubala, you will find it's in about 16 volumes. You know, the man earned himself the title Imam al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, and you know why? If you pick up his book, Mizanul I'tidal, you will understand as to why people said that this man is a sign when it comes to the most difficult science of the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How long do you think it took him to write this book? This book you can find today, depending on the print that you've got, it's in 7 volumes. Each volume is around 500 pages. He wrote this masterpiece of a work. He wrote it in 4 months, less 2 days. 4 months, less 2. You know, when you hear things like this, I don't know about yourself, but the only thing that I can say is La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. This is the dalil for our religion to be the truth. Why? Because if you start working out maths, how is it possible for a man in those days, when there was no computer, when people had to purchase paper and it was expensive, so much so that the muhaddiseen had to even sell their garments, how was it possible for a man to write 270 works? And after acquiring all this knowledge that he was an authority, why is it, my young friends, that he still was a muqallid? Why did he do taqleed? Why did he follow the fiqh of the great Imam al-Shafi'i rahmatullah alayh? Now, one needs to ask himself, today, you know, the deen is a joke. I mean, you had the great Qadi Ayaz. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard of the Ash-Shifa of Qadi Ayaz. The cure. Scholars say no man has ever written a book on the Sirat of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam better than this book, the Shifa of Qadi Ayaz. No before him, no after him. The caliber of the man was such that the great Sahrawi would say that his status was like the status of Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, and the 4 Imams. 4 Imams. He was the one that put Maghrib on the map. And you know, throughout the ages, you will hear the Moroccans saying, Lawla Ayaz ma dhukir al-Maghrib. Had it not been for the great Qadi Ayaz, people would not even know where North of Africa is, where Maghrib, where Morocco is. Allah had blessed his family so much that he was Qazi al-Qudat, Chief Justice. His son was a Qazi. His grandson was a Qazi. His great-grandson was also a Qazi. The last third of the night, this man in his entire life spent standing before the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in prayer. Allah had blessed him so much that when he went to Muslim Spain, more people came to receive him than they came to receive the Amir. And 200 from amongst the greatest people of Granada came to receive the great Qadi Ayaz. Allah had given him such intellect, that the Maqamat of Al-Hariri, this book is taught even in this day and age in the Madaris, and it's an absolute superb work of adab. And Allah had blessed this Hariri so much that this man was able to write in, you know, classical Arabic. He was able to write stories which could be read both ways. What do I mean by this? Let's say he wrote a story. Let me just give you an inkling example. Once upon a time in Bradford there lived so-and-so. If you read that this way, from the beginning till the end, it would read like this. And when you read it from the end to the beginning, it would read in exactly the same way. This was the caliber of the man. So when this work, the Maqamat of Hariri came to his town, he said, I've never seen a book before this. And it's an absolute difficult book. He says, the day I received the book, I did not go to sleep till during the night I mastered it. In one night, he mastered the entire book. You know, once he was saying with a muhaddis and a student came, Allah knows the thickness of the book. He took it off him and began to flick through it and kept on talking to the Shaykh. Stop a while, flick through the book. You know what, the time came to leave, the Shaykh said, look, keep the book with you and take what you need from it. He says, you know what, I've already taken everything that I need from it. Now this is how Allah had blessed him. You know, he was a man of 30 works. Why is it after all this that this man followed the Maliki school of thought? But you know, with regards to him, once, Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Idrisi, he said to him, O Qadi Ayaz, you meet all the conditions of a mujtahid. You are a mujtahid. You meet all the conditions of the mujtahid. You know what the response of the great Qazi Ayaz was? Idrisi himself says, he looked at me with a face with which he never looked at me before this. Meaning, he was offended by this. He was angered by this. That he looked to me with a face which he'd never seen me before this. And he said to me, Hayhata hayhat, ma li ayadin wal ijtihad. Where is ijtihad and where is Qadi Ayaz? Meaning, Qazi Ayaz is far from being a mujtahid. And Qadi Ayaz is saying this hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and inspired the fact that he was an authority, he followed the Maliki school of thought. It'd only be fair if I gave you one example of a Hanafi and one example of a Hanbali before he gives me my red card. I mean, you had the great Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. I mean, you know, I used to get a buzz out of his name. Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. Abdullah, you know, the best names that you can get. And Ibn al-Mubarak, the son of the Blessed One. When he was alive, Ismail ibn Ayyash would say, Ma ala wajhi al-ardi ahadun mithl Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. On the face of the earth, there is no scholar like Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. And every good that Allah has created, it seems that Allah has placed inside this one man. Some scholars went as far as saying that he's like the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's just that the companions have excelled as a result of companionship. And you'd be surprised, one of those that actually said this was the great Ibn Uyayna, Sufyan ibn Uyayna. He says, Nazartu fi amri sahaba wa amri ibn al-Mubarak. I looked at the companions of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I looked at Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, and I saw no virtue for them over him, except as a result of their companionship and their jihad with Rasulullah, which obviously after all is everything. You know, the man earned himself the title Amir al-Mu'mineen. In the world of knowledge, there is no title higher than this, Amir al-Mu'mineen. I mean, I mentioned, anyone that knew 100,000 hadith of Rasulullah off by heart, they would give him the title Hafiz. Anyone that knew 300,000 hadith of Rasulullah off by heart, they would give him the title Hujjah. Anyone that knew all the hadiths off by heart, they would give him the title Hakim. And anyone that was a cut above the rest and beyond, he earned himself the title Amir al-Mu'mineen. Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak was one of the few that earned himself the title the Amir al-Mu'mineen. And why not? You know, as a child, Allah blessed him so much that the narrator says we were going to the maktab and we'd go together. All of a sudden, a man was delivering the khutbah. And he says, by our standards, the khutbah was a very long one. By their standard, if it was a long one, by our standard, it will be extremely long because our khutbah is around 5 minutes and that's about it. You know, the khutbahs in the Arab world around 20-25 minutes. So he was saying by their standard, it was a long khutbah. He says, we stood there and we were listening to the khutbah. After the guy finished the khutbah, Abdullah ibn Mubarak is only a child. He turns around, you know what? I've memorized it. One of the guys in the audience said, what? You've memorized it? Repeat it. The child repeated the entire khutbah, even though he only listened to it just once. This is why he was called Abdullah. This is why he was called the Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was an all-round master. You know, some scholars will be muhaddis, they'll be masters of hadith. It's not necessarily that they're faqih, jurists. But this was one man that had mastered all the sciences, and he was literally an imam in every sciences. This is why people would flock to his gatherings, because they would get from him what they would not get from others. I mean, you've heard of the great Imam Malik, the Imam of Medina. Even he would give respect to Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. I mean, Yahya ibn Ma'in is the narrator, and you know, Yahya ibn Ma'in was a Hanafi. I mean, I just said to you, the great Zahabi was known as being the Imam of Jarh wa Ta'dil. If Imam Zahabi was known as being the Imam of Jarh wa Ta'dil, then you know this Yahya ibn Ma'in and Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, who were both Hanafis, they were the ones that actually laid down the foundations of this science of Jarh and Ta'dil. So he's relating, he says, we were in the gathering of the great Malik. And what happened was one day, Abdullah ibn Mubarak came and permission was asked for him to enter. Permission was given. And we saw that Imam Malik moved from his place and made Abdullah ibn Mubarak sit with him. Yahya ibn Ma'in says, I have never seen the great Malik ever move for anyone other than the great Abdullah ibn Mubarak. The hadiths are now being related upon the great Malik. And every time, now and then, Imam Malik would turn around to Abdullah ibn Mubarak and he would say to him, Ma indakum fi hadha, what do you people have with regards to this? Then Abdullah ibn Mubarak would respond quietly. And when he left the gathering of the great Malik, Imam Malik said to the gathering, this was Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, the faqih of Khurasan, the jurist of Khurasan. Why is it that this man who earned himself a title, which rare will you find any other scholar to have, why was he a Hanafi, and why did he follow the Hanafi school of thought? I mean, I'm having to cut my lecture, just a final example, just to be fair, of a Hanbali. Of a Hanbali, you had the great Ibn al-Jawzi. You know, so blessed he was that he himself is saying that Allah blessed me with a strong sense of Iman even as a child. He says, as a child, I would go to Maktab at the age of 6, and I would find that the children in my class are all older children, bigger children. He says, Allah had blessed me with a fair bit of intellect as a child. That he says, as a child, I cannot remember a single day in which I may have played with somebody on the way to the madrasa. And I cannot remember that I ever laughed excessively in my entire life. My friends, how can that be? You tell me what a 6-year-old does. The only thing a 6-year-old does is laugh and play. And this person is saying, at the age of 6, I never played and I never laughed excessively. He says, at the age of 7, I would come to the Jami' and I would look for a muhaddis. And he would relate the seerah and the tariq to me. And I would memorize everything in the gathering. And I would go home and then I would write it. He says, children, they would come to the river Dajla and they would come to the bridge and they would relax and play. While the children would do this, I would take the Quran and I would distance myself from the people and I would keep myself occupied with the Quran. A child of 7 is saying this. He says, when I would seek knowledge, I would actually feel the sweetness. I would encounter difficulties. But these difficulties to me were more sweeter than honey because of what I was learning or seeking. Allah blessed this guy so much that he was a wa'id. As well as being a muhaddis, he was a speaker. The scholars say that we did not think or we could not imagine that Allah would give any human being that much impact on hearts and minds as much as Allah gave to this one man. Because in his gatherings, all you would hear is people crying and begging Allah's forgiveness. You know, in his one gathering, you would have 100,000 people just listening to his bayan or his wa'az. 100,000 people minimum. He himself says, on my hand, over 100,000 people have repented. He goes a step further and says, 100,000 people plus have declared La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah on my hands. 100,000 people have declared the kalima and entered the fold of Islam as a result of this one man. Allah blessed him so much that some scholars say Some scholars say, and I will conclude on this, some scholars say that if you were to count the days he lived, and when you were to distribute them amongst what he'd written, you'd find that for every day, and they say this with a bit of exaggeration, he wrote 9 copies. 9 exercise books. Let's say that was exaggeration. I mean, even writing 4 a day is phenomenal. The great Ibn Taymiyyah says this man wrote 1,000 works. 1,000 works. Ibn Kathir says he wrote 300 works. One thing is for certain, and the great Zahabi says this, he says, this man has written that many books which no scholar before him or after him has written in Islam. So much so that when he was on his deathbed, he made wasiyah that the water that should be used to give him a bath should be warmed up by using the sharpens of his pens with which he would write the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This water was warmed up with these sharpens. Even after it was warmed up, there was much left over, which gives you an indication of how much was left over. Why is it after having such caliber, this man followed the Hanbali school of thought? I conclude on this note, my young friends. We live in an age of fitna. It's an age to be very, very careful. Very, very careful. Be alert. Do not lead yourself to destruction. And follow the way of the Salaf. And this was the way of the Salaf. Allah give me the tawfiq to act upon what I've said. Allah give you the tawfiq. Wa akhiru dawana alhamdulillah.